Okay, I want to show you how to tie what I like to call a Crackbackigon. It's a PMD crackback pattern, but it's kind of inspired by the wildly popular and successful Paragon. I was just tired of tying the very traditional crackback pattern you might have seen before, where if you tied them before, there's a thin piece of yellow foam that pulls over the top, and then a couple very precisely aligned black bites that pull over it. Not to mention, it's just kind of a bulky fly pattern that it works great, but I just wanted something a little bit different. And so, like I said, this mimics a PMD mayfly nymph that's emerging and cracking from its case as it's emerging into an adult, and or like a sulfur if you don't necessarily have PMDs in your area. But if you fly fish many tailwaters, meaning coming out of a dam in the west or spring creeks, chances are you've got significant PMDs in your area, and this time of year can be really fun to target them. They they can be really effective because of how unique I think they are compared to something like a blue-wing olive that is generally a little bit smaller and uh, a little bit more bland in color. These guys, when they emerge, their body's a bright yellow, and so when they crack their case, that yellow of the body really shows through as they're emerging and rising up to the water column. And trout really seem to key in on that a lot, and so I think that uniqueness is what really makes them really effective. And one of my favorite flies to fish this time of year. I fished them on numerous tailwaters throughout the West. The green and the Provo here in Utah, really effective there. The Henrys, the Truckee, the Clearwater, other sections of the green throughout other states. And for the last few years, this has been one of my top producing flies. And so some of the ways that I like to fish them lately has been on a hopper dropper. Since it's a tungsten weighted fly, it obviously sinks a little bit faster, and so I find it really useful on pocket water where you're fishing to pockets that are, or at least can be, really small. And in order to target those fish with your dropper, you want something heavy that sinks real quick in that very short run that you have when you cast your hopper or dry fly up into there. Um, Other ways would be obviously a more standard nymph rig, and uh, given the weight of these, I like to use as kind of my leading fly off the tag, and then follow it a few feet behind by an unweighted fly, and then just sort of let my indicator judge the depth. Or obviously Euro nymphing, it's uh, very much like a Paragon that originated for Euro nymphing and can work very successfully for that. There's numerous ways you can try them. Feel free to mix it up and leave a comment of how you maybe fish these flies and how they work for you. But the materials are a little bit non-traditional, at least a couple of them. But for starters, we're going to start with a Hannock 400 jig hook. And it's just a very traditional, very standard size jig hook in a number 16. That's about as big as I like to tie for these bugs. I'll go down to an 18 and even sometimes a 20, but obviously 16 is a little bigger and that's a little easier to tie, and still will probably catch your fish even if 18s or possibly even 20s are coming off. Next is a 2.5 millimeter bead. These are the Firehold Gold slotted tungsten in 2.5. I feel like it gives it pretty good proportions. And what I mean by that is PMD nymphs between the tail and the abdomen and the thorax are all very similar in length. And so pay attention to that as you're tying this fly and other flies. as far as those proportions goes, and try to keep it as true to that as you can, and you're going to end up with a more realistic and better looking fly. Next is probably the most unique of these materials. This is just like a standard paintbrush with nylon fibers, and it's basically the same material as a lot of your tippets, but I kind of scored on this one. It's very uniform in color, and it's this kind of slightly transparent brownish color, and so it works on almost any color thread, and it just enough to kind of darken the ribs a little bit when I use them for ribs, and even for tails, which is how I'm going to be using it for this fly. It's also really durable. I mean, it's a heavy jig fly. It bounces off the bottom quite a bit. It gets pretty beat up, and I've never lost any tails on this. The fibers are even, you'll see when we start tying, the fibers are even very gradually tapered. And so when used as a rib on a body, it kind of gives it this nice buggy taper to it as well. Just a big fan of the paintbrush. Super versatile. Go and pick some up, especially if you can find one similar to this. Huge fan of this. I use it a bunch. Next material, I guess I should have started with this one, is a thread. This is a Veevus 14-aught, and I use the 14-aught. It's a really fine thread, and that's mostly just because I like to keep the profile of this fly very slender and slim. That's just kind of been what I've done with a lot of my flies lately, is I kind of prefer a more slender body to my flies. But feel free to use like a rusty brown colored UTC 70, which I've also used on these flies and still works phenomenal. I've just grown to prefer a more slender body shape. Next is, I use this, this is the UV Pearl Crystal Flash, and I just take a little strand of it and wrap around the collar to kind of give it that flash to the collar. It's real subtle, really easy to work with, and this obviously lasts forever. Next is the resin, and I've used colored resins before. Normally on a Paragon nymph, you have kind of a black dot to represent the wing case on the bead, and maybe comment what your thoughts are about colored resins. The ones that I've tried just tend to be not very vivid and not very crisp as far as the color goes. And maybe I just got a bad batch, but leave a comment and let me know. That's why I have this Sharpie, and so after I've tied my fly and I want to leave that wing case on top, I just kind of, well, you'll see I'll use that Sharpie to sort of dot it and then put a little drip of UV to protect it and hold it in place. Then on top of that, this is just Testors model paint. Like I was saying earlier, colored UVs, I'm kind of iffy about. This was only $2, and you can get it, you could probably find it at Walmart. If not, it's available just about anywhere. The colors are very crisp, and so that's why I really like it. It just gives you a really clean line when you use this to represent that crack in the case and that yellow kind of showing through. And then lastly is just a very small scrap of small wire, and we're going to use this just to dot the top with the yellow paint to kind of give us that oval shape. And obviously it's got to dry for a little bit, which is a little bit of a downside compared to a UV. So feel free to mix them up. If you have colored UVs you like, by all means, use those. But once this is dry, I put a real thin layer of UV on top just to hold it intact and make it more durable. I've been using this Bone Dry Plus, the new Bone Dry by Solarez, that is just really durable. Like I was saying earlier, this fly, it's a heavy jig fly. It hits bottom all the time. It's bouncing around down there. It gets pretty abused, and I have yet to see this stuff crack like I have in other brands. So without ado, let's get started. Okay, we have our size 16 jig hook and a 2.5 millimeter tungsten slotted bead with our rusty 14-aught Veevus. I'm going to take the thread all the way to the very end of the hook shank. And jump right into our tails. I like to take 3 of the fibers from the paintbrush, and sometimes I'll put them in my stacker just to line the tips up. Like I said in the materials list, feel free to use something other than this. I understand that this material might be a little tricky to find, or is, it's fairly unique. But something like Microfibets or Coq de Leon or wood duck or mallard in sort of that yellowish tan sort of color would probably work great. I just really like these paintbrush fibers, and they're just really durable. So I only got a couple wraps on my fibers, and that gives me time to help line them up on top. And notice I left them kind of long. That way it's easier to attach them, and now I can just pull them to the length that I want. And on the proportions of a PMB, the tail and the thorax and the abdomen are all about the same length. And proportions are something you want to pay close attention to when you're trying to mimic a bug, whether it's a dry fly or a nymph or anything. So I only want these tails to be about half as long as the hook shank. And so that ends up being just slightly past the bend of the hook. I like that. I'm going to work forward while keeping my tail fibers on the top of my hook shank, and then letting them kind of help me hold the bead in place. Let them kind of fall into the groove. Snip those off as close as we can. And we're going to take a 4th fiber. Looks like I got a few little stray strands here from bumping my thread. Not that big a deal. If I can get them off. I'm going to put the tip of that 4th paintbrush fiber right in against the bead and work my way back. And then forward again. This is why I like this 14-aught thread, is because it doesn't build up bulk so fast as the UTC 70 would. Even though the UTC 70 still works great for this, I just prefer a more slender body to my flies lately. After I got that all trapped, I want to add just a little bit of a very gradual taper to the bug. Even though the taper of the rib will give it a nice buggy look, but I'm still going to add a little bit of a taper to it. And when I do this, I kind of divide the body into thirds, and I go down a third and then back up a third, and then down 2/3 and then back up that 2/3. And at this point, I like to unwind my thread counterclockwise to sort of flatten it. And that will help me really smooth the body out and just clean it up. Sometimes it's hard to tell if it's starting to flatten out, especially with this really fine thread. If you let your bobbin just rest real carefully, it will start to unwind the direction you need to go. And there we go. It's starting to flatten out pretty well now. So I'm just going to give it a quick once over, down and back with this flat thread. And that really helps clean it up a bit. At this point, I went a little too far. I want to stop at about that 1/3 mark. And this is where I'm going to put in my Krystal flash. Notice I left the tag fairly long. That way it's easier to grab and snip off as close as you can. At this point, I'm going to use my bobbin rest to get that out of the way and give me plenty of room to get a few wraps of this Krystal flashing around the collar. Once you work that forward, I only want to get just a couple wraps in there to hold it snug. It doesn't take much, and I'm trying to keep that body real slender. Once that's in place, now I'm going to work my rib forward. It also goes over the top of that tinsel and helps make it a little more durable and helps hold it in place. Otherwise, tinsel tends to be a little fragile. All right, I got a couple wraps behind it, a couple wraps in front of it. And now what I'm going to do is snip it off as close as I can. And that's pretty much it as far as the materials goes. Last is just a little bit of UV. I'm gonna put a whip finish in there. Snip it off close. If you don't have a pair of very fine point sharp scissors, I highly recommend it. Now, if you have a black UV resin that you like, by all means, use this. If you've tied a paragon before or seen them, there's usually a black dot on the top of the bead to represent the wing case. But I just haven't found a black UV resin that I like that is very crisp and vivid. If you have one you like, leave it in the comments and let me know. Maybe I can give it a try, or I just got a bad batch. But instead, I'm going to take this black Sharpie and just kind of color the cap, just the very top of this bead, and then down into that groove of the bead. And that will give us our wing case. Now I'm just going to put just a small little drip of UV over the top of where we just made our mark with the marker. There we go. Don't let it run down too far or it'll get in your eyelet and then is a pain to chisel out. Last step is to take this model paint, and if you have a yellow UV resin that you like, by all means use this, but this works really well and it's a very crisp color and it dries flat, and after it's coated with that last final layer of UV, it's really durable. So I'm gonna get my wire, just that little scrap of small wire, and get just maybe a 1/4 inch of it is all coated with paint. All I want is a small drip on there. To kind of give me that oval crackback shape, that signature crackback shape that trout often will key in on. And that's really it. All we got to do is let that dry and then coat it with a final layer of UV resin. What I like to do while it dries is just take an old pair of hackle pliers and pinch in there and set it out of the way. Be prepared to possibly make a mess of it with your paint like I just barely did. Wow, yeah, I really made a mess this time. But anyways, there you go. Tie them up. Leave in the comments if you've been able to give them a try and if they worked out for you, and enjoy.